Hi everyone, I'm here to speak about Prop 62 and why this measure matters for racial justice. This measure, as I'm sure folks know, abolishes the death penalty. Given the pervasive racial discrimination in the criminal justice system and in the application of the death penalty in particular, this measure is a pretty important step for advancing racial justice here in California. So what does Prop 62 do? Well, specifically, it abolishes the death penalty and replaces it with life in prison without the possibility of parole. This measure also retroactively applies to prisoners who are currently on death row so that they won't be put to death by the state. And then for prisoners who have been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, this measure requires that they work and pay restitution to victims' families. Now, why does this proposition matter for racial justice? Well, as I'm sure people know, there is a long history in this country of prosecutors and judges using the death penalty in a racially discriminatory manner. This was largely confirmed through empirical research in the 1980s with the Baldus study. In this study, researchers analyzed over 2,000 murder cases in Georgia and found significant racial disparities with the use of the death penalty. The reason for those disparities largely had to do with prosecutors. So prosecutors sought the death penalty in 70% of cases involving black defendants and white victims, compared to just 19% of cases involving white defendants and black victims. That's an incredibly wide margin, and because of that margin, defendants charged with killing white victims were 4.3 times more likely to receive the death penalty than people who were charged with killing black victims. So, I think that's a clear indication of the kind of inequity in the use of the death penalty. And this kind of racial discrimination, unfortunately, continues to be a serious problem here in California today. So California is home to the largest death row population in the entire Western Hemisphere. And people of color make up a disproportionate amount of this population. Consider this, 37% of people on death row are black, compared to, or I should say, even though black people make up just 6.5% of the total population in California. That's a huge, huge disparity. And overall, nearly 2/3 of the death row population is black and Latino. Again, another huge racial disparity. Now, the simplest way to prevent racial discrimination with the use of the death penalty is to end it altogether. And Prop 62 does exactly that. And so, in this sense, it is a very important reform, one that will help advance racial justice here in California. Now, unfortunately, I have to say that it doesn't look like the measure currently has majority support from voters in California. The Los Angeles Times put out a poll on September 16th indicating that the majority of voters oppose Prop 62, specifically 51% oppose and 40% support. And I know my time is up, and so just one kind of quick thing to add here about the way in which this measure could potentially be in trouble on Election Day is that if Prop 66 passes and has more yes votes, Prop 66 is a pro-death penalty measure. If it has more yes votes than Prop 62, then Prop 62 will not pass. That means getting this important measure, Prop 62, passed on Election Day is going to be quite challenging. So, if you're talking to friends and family about the election, I really encourage you to share information about this proposition to ensure that folks do not skip over this important measure when they vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Jason, who is very tall?
Yeah, question up front.
in recent years, there's been a proliferation of innocence projects, but those focus on those condemned to death. Has anybody done a study of what would the effect be on those projects? Would they tend to fall apart? Would they tend not to focus on people with life sentences?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm in a position to answer that question. I don't know if there have been any studies or any sort of articles put out there indicating whether or not those projects would continue. I imagine they would, but I can't say for sure. In the blue shirt.
Yeah, so I have two questions. One's
Okay.
quick and one's not so quick. The quick one is, do you know, I haven't read it, so do you know if the proposition's worded in the negative, like the Prop 8 one was? Like to be confusing?
The language is pretty clear. I don't think voter confusion will be a problem on Proposition 62. And then you had a second question, right?
Yeah. Do you know what the mechanism for paying restitution would look like?
Yeah, so the question was, what would be the mechanism for paying restitution? I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism would look like. What I can share with you is that the measure does specify that it would be 60% of wages.
Prison wages,
Prison wages,
which isn't much.
which is not much. And I think there are some definitely legitimate criticisms of this part of the measure insofar as it reinforces a prison labor system that is profoundly unjust. Question?
What happens if measure 62 and 66 both pass?
If measure 62 and 66 both pass, then if Proposition 66 has more yes votes, passes by a higher percentage than Prop 62, then Prop 62 will not pass.
Even though they're both passed, if it's more yes on 66?
Correct. Question up here.
I don't know if you can speak to this, but it was under my impression was it actually costs much more to put someone to death under the death penalty than to keep them in prison for their life. So first of all, can you speak to that at all?
Well, the question essentially was, can you speak to the fact that it costs more in the state of California to put someone to death than it does to keep them in prison for life? So to speak to that directly, that's exactly right. So Proposition 62, if passed, will save the state money. That means it's going to save taxpayer money, which will reduce prison costs overall. And certainly, it's my hope and the hope of others that that money would be funneled to, I think, more worthwhile services. But I can't speak to what the plans are for that money or if anything's been earmarked. Yeah, question in the back.
Yeah, I understand that if a person now gets a sentence of life without parole, that doesn't mean anything because they can apply for parole later. Would this be truly life without parole if 62 passes?
So the question, as I understand it, is would, if 62 passes, this mean life without the possibility of parole if someone is given that sentence, and truly mean that? My understanding is that it does. I don't necessarily have more to say than that.
Okay, I will say that I have spent a lot of time in a prison, a Christian prison ministry, and I would say that life without parole is a far greater punishment than the death penalty. Knowing prisoners, it's a far greater punishment. That's just a statement, not a question.
Right. Okay, thank you for that statement. Yes?
Can you explain the difference between 62 and 66?
Yeah, happy to explain the difference. So Proposition 66 is a pro-death penalty proposition. Specifically, what Prop 66 does is it speeds up the process by which the state would put someone to death So it limits legal challenges to a death penalty sentence to 5 years. So the intent of that proposition is to speed up that process to 5 years. Yes,
Seems
question
like,
over
I
there.
was just gonna go look at the booklet, but it seems like I remember when I read through it, it's worded, that one is worded like reform the death penalty. Is that right? But it doesn't, I wasn't clear that it was actually making it quicker instead of like addressing the justice issues around it. So,
Yeah, I think there's definitely some potentially confusing language with Proposition 66 that it's important for voters to be aware of. So thank you for pointing that out too. Any other questions?
Thank you, Jason, very much.